It's a powerful point. When you're Afro-Latino, there's a sense in which you feel racially homeless because you fit neatly into neither category. Your identity is intersectional rather than binary. I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post almost a year ago about a tradition that prohibits membership in both the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus. Under the traditions of Congress, you can either be Black or Latino, but you cannot be both. But you and I know in the real world, you can be both.
Right.
I am both Latino and African American, and I refuse to choose one identity to the exclusion of the other.
Right.
I insist on embracing the intersectionality of who I am. And so I'm among the first members of Congress to ever break the barrier and join both the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus.
What up? It's Dramos, and this is the recap. Of course, as I do each and every week, I'll be breaking down some of the biggest headlines from this last week. I have an incredible guest hopping on in just a little bit. It'll be Congressman Richie Torres out of New York. He'll be helping me break down some of the nonsense that we've seen from Democrats in this last week and the people that I can speak for myself that we fought so hard to put into office this last election cycle. So we'll dive into a lot of stuff and get his perspective as a Democrat who is in office. Now, before he hops on, let's dive into some of the other nonsense that we've seen from this last week, man, some of the BS. Now, one of the bigger stories from this last week, and rightfully so, is all that's going on in Texas. So Texas was hit by extreme weather conditions that brought snow and ice, and millions of people are now without power and many even without water as a result. The death toll is quickly rising and shortages are happening in things like gas and food, which is obviously a very scary thing to see as these things are so essential to just daily life as a human being. Now, many people are even predicting that this could even be the costliest natural disaster in the state's history. Now, amidst all of this, though, we got to say, one thing that we should be able to count on, right, that we can count on, is that our leadership is doing all they can to help their citizens and the people responsible for putting them in office, right? Well, that would be true if you actually still believe that most politicians actually give a damn about the people they're representing. And if you somehow needed more proof that many of these people don't actually care about us, look no further than mullet enthusiast and Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who, while witnessing the people of his state in dire circumstances, even going as far as to warn people to stay home as it was too dangerous for them to go out.
This storm is dangerous, and there's a second storm expected to hit this week, which will make things even worse. So if you can stay home, don't go out on the roads, don't risk the ice. I was speaking this weekend with a meteorologist expert who was saying the combination of these two storms, we could see up to 100 people lose their lives this week in Texas. So don't risk it. Keep your family safe and just stay home and hug your kids.
He decides that now would be a good time to hop on a flight to beautiful, sunny, and warm Cancun, Mexico for a little family vacation. That's right. While people are struggling to stay warm and find clean drinking water, Ted was getting an early start on spring break with only two things on his mind: catching a sick tan and getting completely white girl wasted before dinner.
I think your boyfriend is perfect, and I love him. And Kelly is...
Now listen, I don't want to condemn all of our country's representatives. Obviously, we can't sit there and use a blanket term that none of them care, because some of them genuinely seem like they're interested in helping people. My guest today being one of them. But moments like this, they really prove the point that many of the people who are in charge of representing us, the everyday person, they just don't live in the same reality as us. And that's a problem. And now, again, listen, not all politicians are bad. And people like Ted Cruz should be taking notes from representatives like our queen, AOC, who, while Ted Cruz was on a plane enjoying a double shot of tequila, she decided that she would take it upon herself to take action, and to date has raised over $2 million in relief for Texans. And she also hopped on a plane herself, except unlike our buddy Teddy, her plane was actually heading towards Texas, not away from it. Now, listen, I don't want to just focus on all the bad in this world because, that's really depressing to just think that the world is made up of a bunch of Ted Cruzes who just don't care about anybody else but themselves. So before Congressman Richie Torres hops on, I do want to break up the nonsense a little bit with someone who's truly just a ray of sunshine in this crazy world that we live in. And of course, that's none other than Bad Bunny, who is truly just living his best life right now. And as he says, he does what he wants, and he truly continues to do so. Now, even becoming a reoccurring character in the world of pro wrestling, and even going as far as to become the WWE 24/7 champion this past week. Amidst all the chaos that is this world, Bad Bunny somehow, some way, just keeps on finding ways to enjoy this life. And honestly, you have to admire that. Now, I wish I can keep pushing out here these feel-good stories for you, but there's sadly just too much nonsense happening in this world and too many important conversations that we need to be having. So back to the BS we go. Now, my guest this week, help me break it all down, is a congressman representing New York's 15th District, Ritchie Torres. Congressman, how we feeling?
I'm doing well. The month of February is less dramatic compared to the events of January. So.
Yes, and that which is good. Yeah, I like the positive spin on it all right there. That's a good way to look at it, glass half full, which I like. But unfortunately, the nonsense still kind of continues on, right? Maybe it's not as terrible and egregious as people storming the Capitol, but we're still seeing some nonsense. And I know in the media, we've talked about Donald Trump and the Republican Party as a whole kind of ad nauseum, right? They kind of are what they are. They've showed us their cards. We know what to expect at this point. So I also want to focus in on the Democratic Party because there's been some kind of developments, some might say bad, some might say good, depending on what you're thinking. And I think it's important that we kind of all hold each other responsible and have these conversations. So, I kind of want to start chronologically where my show ended last week was getting ready to kind of hear more about Donald Trump's second impeachment and what the verdict would be. Now, it came quicker than we kind of anticipated. And there's kind of been some criticism, some backlash towards the Democrats because of the way that it ended. Ari Melber from MSNBC, I thought, put it really well. He said, and I quote, "Democrats presented a cognate impeachment case with detailed evidence, won a bipartisan vote to add key witnesses, then backed down on witnesses, ending the trial early, stripping their own case of any eyewitness testimony." Now, what was your reaction to this whole thing? Kind of where do you fall on what you saw, the way the Democrats kind of handle this impeachment trial?
That analysis misses the forest for the trees.
Okay.
No amount of compelling evidence would have persuaded enough Republicans to impeach Donald Trump.
That's a good point. Yep.
The acquittal of Donald Trump in the Senate is ultimately an indictment of the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
It is an impeachable offense on the part of the Republican Party. It's a high crime and misdemeanor against American democracy. Calling the Republican Party Republican has become a form of deceptive advertising. Mm. Because the Republican Party is willing to sacrifice everything, including the Republic itself, on the altar of Donald Trump. Right? The Republicans, half the Republican conference in the House of Representatives, voted to overturn the results of the election.
Yeah.
Voted to reject the peaceful transfer of power. So that speaks to the radicalism, the extremism of the Republican Party in 2021. So no amount of evidence would have persuaded Republicans to all of a sudden see the evil of Donald Trump.
Right.
The Republican Party, as we know it, is a lost cause.
Which I agree with, but I will say, to respectfully push back, I will say that as somebody who's traditionally voted Democrat, I also didn't think that this would come up. I didn't think they would get the supermajority needed to actually get him out of there, get him barred from running for office, all of the above, right? But I still would have at least loved to have seen the fight. You know what I mean? To see that Democrats just had the fight and they would say, regardless of what the end result is going to be, we are going to make you watch and see exactly all that's happened. And we're not going to just let you get off that easily. And it kind of felt like he was let off the hook just a little bit easier than he should have been, personally.
But we did fight. The siege took hold on January 6th.
Right.
And within a week, we impeached Donald Trump. And he's the first president to be impeached not once, but twice. And the impeachment managers who were making the case in the Senate were themselves eyewitnesses. The Republicans in the Senate were themselves eyewitnesses. Remember, the rioters stormed the Capitol with the intention of not only doing harm to Democrats, but also doing harm to Republicans. Right? Those rioters were screaming, "Hang Mike Pence." Right? Those rioters erected a gallows and a noose in order to hang Mike Pence. So the Republicans themselves were eyewitnesses to and targets of the insurrection that Donald Trump incited with his own words.
Yeah. I mean, I think those are all great points, and you're absolutely right. I guess to me, it sort of hits a little bit of a touchy subject that a lot of people talk about, where they feel like Democrats as a whole aren't aggressive enough, right? Are still trying to play by these old school political rules, which is admirable. But from what Donald Trump has shown us, the other side is not playing by any damn rules anymore. And we're kind of really getting to a scary place. We're really seeing radicalized, citizens of this country following white supremacists, following conspiracy theories, all these different things. And it feels as if we still keep trying to play by the same old politics and sort of like this honor system, we may lose to these people who are hitting below the belt at some point. What do you kind of say to that argument when it comes to the Democratic Party?
I share your critique.
Yeah. Okay.
I share your critique. We as Democrats have to be every bit as ruthless and relentless in building Democratic power as Mitch McConnell is in building Republican power, which means abolishing the filibuster, which means legislating statehood for DC so that we have a majority Black state, and legislating statehood for Puerto Rico so that we have a majority Latino state, and legislating both statehood for both DC and Puerto Rico would likely yield 4 Democratic U.S. senators. It would solidify Democratic control of the U.S. Senate for the foreseeable future, and it would strengthen our chances of keeping the House in 2022. So that's, we have to be more aggressive in building Democratic power. I agree, and we cannot allow ourselves to be outmaneuvered by the Machiavellian Mitch McConnell.
No, and I'm really happy to hear you say, and it's refreshing to hear you say that. And it's one of the things I enjoy about you, because it's the criticism, the critique is welcome, because we need to be having those hard conversations, even if it is to our own acquaintances, even if it is to the people who are quote unquote fighting for on the same side as us. Now, another one of those things was Biden, taking a stance that he was only going to forgive up to $10,000 of student loan debt, right? And I know you've been somebody who's been outspoken saying he not only has the power to do up to $50,000, but also owes it to the people and should be doing up to $50,000. I mean, let me hear your perspective after hearing him kind of so, standing up there and really definitely saying, this is where I stand on it. I'm sort of feeling like he didn't, give any room for budging almost.
The majority leader, Chuck Schumer, has come out in favor of canceling debt up to $50,000. So it's a mainstream position within the Democratic Party.
Yes.
And the president should be in touch with the mainstream of his party. And, some people said, oh, you should never say anything critical. Like, I'm here to express my opinions. I'm not here to be a party loyalist for the sake of it. I have a few thoughts. One, our system of higher education is broken. It produces far more debt than degrees.
Yes.
Right? Especially in places like the Bronx. Students are often graduating from college, not with a degree that lifts them up, but with debt that lifts them down.
Yes. And not to cut you off, but I feel like even a lot of my friends are not even in fields that they studied in college. So that degree is a worthless piece of paper now, because they couldn't even find the career they were promised after spending that 4 years studying their ass off, paying, getting into tens of thousands of dollars in debt. And the paper is worthless because they can't find a career in that field they were promised. So that to me is like the egregious thing, and people just seem to keep ignoring about this problem, in our colleges and society as a whole.
It's predatory pricing in broad daylight.
Yeah.
America has a $1.7 trillion debt burden affecting 43 million Americans. And think about the implications of student debt. Right? The majority of millennials, the majority of members of Generation Z cite student debt as the main reason for delaying the decision to buy a home. And without home ownership, you have no real means of building intergenerational wealth, of passing wealth from one generation to the next. Right? The basis for the wealth gap in America between Black households and white households is home ownership.
Yeah.
So the most critical decisions we make in our life, the decision to buy a home, the decision to open a business, the decision to have children, get married, form a family, all of those decisions are distorted and delayed by the overhang of student debt.
Yeah, you're hitting on something. I don't mean to cut you off because you just touched close to home, because I recently just closed on a property. But let me tell you, the one thing that they hung over my head was the fact that I had student loan debt, and I had never been in default, never missed a payment, wasn't late or anything. But they still brought that up, and we're like, well, you have some student loan debts. Well, so does how many million Americans in the country. You're going to hold that against me when I've been on top of my payments and tell me that I can't now. The house that I've earned to buy, you're telling me you're going to give me a hassle about being able to purchase that home. And that's what I think a lot of, unfortunately, your colleagues are missing that. They're not living in this reality of people of my generation and your generation as well.
Now, there are those who argue that we should take a targeted approach. We've taken a targeted approach before, and it has failed miserably. There's the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. It dates back to 2007. And there were students who chose to go into the not-for-profit sector or into the government for 10 years, a significant share of their lives, in order to qualify for public service loan forgiveness.
Wow.
So in 2017, more than 20,000 students applied for public service loan forgiveness. Only 100 were approved.
Wow.
So there were tens of thousands of people who reordered their lives around the expectation of receiving loan forgiveness based on a decade of public service, only to be effectively defrauded by the federal government.
Yeah.
So history tells us that targeted debt cancellation is ineffective. You need broad-based relief
for
students who are struggling with debt. And there's one more argument, economic stimulus. According to the Federal Reserve, students on average pay somewhere between $200 and $300 every month for their student debt. Many of these people are single mothers from the Bronx. If you cancel student debt, that is the equivalent of sending those families a monthly check of $300. And when you have $300 in your pocket, you can spend that with local businesses. It benefits not only those businesses, but the workers employed by those businesses.
Right.
It's the only form of economic stimulus that the president can implement by executive order. Everything else requires the approval of Congress. So for me, the case for broad-based student debt cancellation is airtight.
No, and I agree completely, and especially what we're seeing right now with this pandemic and the effects that it's had on people. Anything that we can do to alleviate some sort of stress for people should be done, and it's a duty of the people that we've put in office to do that. And I love what you're saying and all this. And quickly before I let you get out of here, kind of shifting gears. I mean, obviously we're amidst Black History Month right now. When you were elected, there was some great headlines about you making history as an Afro-Latino being elected to office. I also kind of feel like it's this weird gray area, and you can correct me if you have a different experience, in the Latin community, where Afro-Latinos and Afro-Latinas, they kind of seem to exist in like this gray space, right? I mean, historically, we've all seen the colorism and the effects of that. But even when it comes to something like Black history, they're often left out of the conversation, by our own community, but also by the outside community. I mean, where do you kind of feel? I mean, you're somebody who is literally making history, and hopefully your name will be spoken amongst those greats. Where do you kind of, stand on that? How does that kind of make you feel?
It's a powerful point. When you're Afro-Latino, there's a sense in which you feel racially homeless because you fit neatly into neither category. Your identity is intersectional rather than binary. I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post almost a year ago about a tradition that prohibits membership in both the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus. Under the traditions of Congress, you can either be Black or Latino, but you cannot be both. But you and I know in the real world, you can be both.
Right.
I am both Latino and African American, and I refuse to choose one identity to the exclusion of the other.
Right.
I insist on embracing the intersectionality of who I am. And so I'm among the first members of Congress to ever break the barrier and join both the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus.
No, I love that. Yeah, 100%. Remain true to who you are. And I think it sets the example. And I mean, we can dive into a bunch of different examples. I'm not going to sit here and keep you for the next hour on that. But I mean, even what we saw with the election, how Latinos were categorized into one box is a whole nother thing, you know.
Take one more example.
Yeah.
You know, the inauguration, the image of Kamala Harris, first African American, the first Asian American, the first woman in the vice presidency, being sworn in by the first Latina, Sonia Sotomayor. Like that moment captures the intersectionality of America.
Yes.
And that moment reminds us that the future of our country does not belong to white supremacy. It belongs to multiracial democracy.
Yes. Very, very well put. I love that. And it's such a powerful statement and one of hope, I feel like, for so many people watching right now and kids coming up. So last thing I have to ask, because this is always close to my heart. I know you mentioned statehood for Puerto Rico. I mean, talk to me about where we are in that process. I mean, obviously, I know that they voted in favor of it during their last election cycle. I mean, where are we here as far as in the actual states, of that's actually happening, not happening? What do you kind of see going on?
Well, Latinos being Latinos, there's disagreement among Latinos about what's best for Puerto Rico. Half of the Puerto Rican conference favors statehood, and half of the Puerto Rican conference in Congress is against it. Here's my view. What matters is not what I want. What matters is not what my colleagues in Congress want. What matters is what the people on the island want. And how we determine the will of the people. We hold elections. Well, there was a referendum, and a majority of the people on the island voted for statehood. And when the people have spoken, we have an obligation in Congress to legislate what the people voted. That is democracy. That is decolonization. That is self-determination. So my argument is follow the will of the people. If the people on the island had voted against statehood, then I would accept the will of the people. Because what I want is far less important than what the people on the island want. But if the people on the island are asking for representation, are asking for equality, how can we possibly say no? How can we possibly deny them 2 U.S. senators? How can we possibly deny them 5 members of Congress? Right? There's no substitute for representation within your own country. I love Puerto Rico. I'm Puerto Rican. But I cannot effectively represent the island from the South Bronx.
Right.
The island deserves representation of its own. And a wise person once said, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably on the menu. And Puerto Ricans are tired of being on the menu. And they need and deserve a seat at the table. And statehood is how you get a seat at the table.
That's a bar, Richie. I gotta agree with you on that. I've never been truly pro statehood, but you're absolutely right. The people have spoken, and it's not for me or you, like you said, to tell them what they should or shouldn't be doing when they have fairly spoken on their point of view. So I love that perspective, and it's fair. That's a very fair.
I want to be clear, and I think there's too much mudslinging. People of good faith can disagree.
Yeah.
Right. I have a disagreement on this issue with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Nydia Velázquez. But there is no doubt in my mind that Nydia Velázquez and Alexandria are deeply committed to the best interest of Puerto Rico. They love Puerto Rico every bit as much as I do, and Nydia has spent her life advocating for the island. So this is a respectful disagreement. It should be possible to express disagreement without descending into character assassination or mudslinging. And too often there's mudslinging on all sides.
No, I agree. And last thing I want to ask, because you said that, do you see the Democratic Party, the future of the Democratic Party, being more so like that kind of mindset of what you're saying? Or do you see them still kind of trying to stick with the old mindset like the Joe Biden where we touched on student loan debt, right? You're saying, and this is all obviously with respect, but he's not listening to what people are asking for, right? They're kind of stuck in their old ways to a degree. What do you see the future of the Democratic Party? Is it more so people like yourself and the AOCs of the world? who agree to disagree and trying really to be the voice of the people? Or is it kind of this old guard that doesn't seem to want to give up the old politics and the old mindset that really it doesn't serve everybody as a whole or this next generation?
I think the next generation of leaders are much younger, much more diverse, much more progressive, and more disruptive, willing to cause good trouble in order to challenge the status quo. If you are a millennial or remember Generation Z, you've largely known government failure.
Yeah.
You've lived through 9/11. You've lived through the catastrophic wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. You've lived through the Great Recession of 2008. You've lived through the killing of Black and brown people at the hands of police. You've seen the cruelty and corruption of our criminal justice system. You've lived through the pandemic. Government has failed you, or you're struggling with the crushing cost of healthcare and housing and higher education. So I'm part of a new generation of good troublemakers who want to make the system work for the next generation.
I love that, man. That's beautiful and refreshing to hear, especially as it feels like so much of our world is kind of burning around us to a degree, and so much, so many of our voices are not being heard unless we're causing, some sort of destruction. Then all of a sudden people wake up and listen to it, so it's nice to hear that there are people in these positions of power that are listening and do understand that the old way is not working for everybody, and that we need to have a drastic shift in this country. So I thank you for that, man. I thank you for being accessible and being honest in this conversation. I really do.
Always a pleasure. Good to see you.
Man, thank you once again to my guest this week, Congressman Richie Torres. I always appreciate when someone as busy as him takes the time out to have a real conversation and to inform and educate the people out there. And honestly, fulfilling his duty of being a voice for the people that he represents and being accessible to those people. So big shout out to him for doing the right thing in those terms. Make sure you give him a follow on social media. He's always having very important conversations on there. So definitely worth checking out. Now, before I get out of here, of course, it's kind of been a bit of a heavier show, right? So my positivity is probably needed even more now than ever. Now, of course, I always end the show with a positive quote. Being Black History Month, we are in the midst of Black History Month right now. I've made it a point to make all of our positive quotes for this month come from people in the African-American as well as the Afro-Latino community. And this week, it only felt right to have a quote from our former president, Barack Obama. And that quote is, "Change will not come if we wait for some other person or if we wait for some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek." And this is so incredibly powerful and so true of this moment right now. I mean, I started off the show talking about, representatives and many of whom not actually caring about their constituents, not caring about the people that they actually were put in office to represent. And they just continue to show us example after example, like Ted Cruz did with Texas. So it's important for us to use our platforms, our voices, and take action in any way that we can. That's, of course, peaceful and lawful, but, not sitting back and hoping that these people are going to do the right thing. We have to keep our proverbial foot on their neck and hold them accountable for representing us and doing what's right for the people that they've been elected to represent and take care of it. And that's what we have to keep doing. That's why it's so important for me to continue to have these types of conversations, to not just get caught up in the entertainment world and these sexy and exciting stories, or, having just people on this show who are in the entertainment world, but also being able to have a diverse group of people coming on here every single week, informing our community and showing us, just how important it is to be informed, be knowledgeable, and then to also take action once we receive that knowledge. So, man, just an amazing quote that is just so appropriate for the time period that we live in right now. That's it, though. Thank y'all so much for the support on the show. Every week, man, we're growing, and I love seeing the feedback. Thank you guys so much for checking this out every single week. And if it's your first time, I hope to see you next week. And, man, got another great show, of course, coming up next week. But until then, stay safe. I'll talk to y'all soon. Bye.